Hello, beautiful people. What's up? We're going to be talking about typography today, and we're going to be celebrating the life and times of the late and great Virgil Abloh, who passed away last year. So I'm scared for myself. I'm scared for our students. I wonder how this is all going to go.
I couldn't find it in the high enough resolution, so I also had to keep it small enough.
You don't have $10,000 to buy a suitcase just for this project? Come on. There's levels of commitment here, man.
Jesus Christ, kid, it looks like a death notice. So you're doing the right thing, which is in this case the wrong thing. And so I was sort of sad that happened.
When Charles mentioned the blur type, I'm like, where's the blur type? If you're going to blur something, really blur it, because that's just like a little baby blur there. I just wanted to say one quick editorial note here.
Go for it.
Clip that video with the audio of Charles saying that. That's a TikTok video, 10 and a half point time, 16 something pica measure. Let's make that go viral, guys. We're going to move over to Charles. Charles, take it over.
Who am I doing first?
Let me read the names here. Maggie. And then
Let me do Maggie first then.
Yeah.
I had one thing to show because I had the product from Viksha's.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Just for, so you guys see that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So that was the black sort of plastic cloth that was inspired there.
But you know what's interesting, even in this photo, is that you can still read the forms. So playing around with levels of black, you could tell that there's a person standing in front of a background, but there's space between them, and you could still see the silhouette, which is something you want to be very mindful of.
Now, I hope you're seeing Maggie's piece. What I really liked about this was the sort of boldness and directness of it. I like the commitment to that red rectangle. I like the use of the blur, even though it's artificial, to sort of that combined with the translucency gives it sort of layering and depth. I respond well to the sort of differentiation of, or what I would call declination, but differentiation of sizes between the largest, the medium, and the small type. So those are the things that I really think are going for this poster. I like the off-centered composition, the middle part, the breaking boundaries, which I consider that in the arrow, I consider the sort of focal points of the composition. That's where I'm going to get meaning from this composition. It seems to get sort of mixed as a metaphor or overwrought because there's the breaking of boundaries in the setting of the type. So the word breaking is halfway through, turns into italic. It changes weight. Then you also break the word breaking from the word boundaries. And then the word boundaries gets broken by the arrow. Then on top of all that, you get this sort of waterfall of type off the edge. So I think any of the breaking things like breaking lines, breaking style, breaking form are one kind of metaphor. But the waterfall is something else. It says falling, or it says cascade, or it says trailing off. It has sort of like different connotations than the idea of breaking. So I would like to see. Even though it's a big part of the sort of interest in the middle of the composition, I would like to see it go away. I don't think the composition would be worse for it. And I think you could really hone in on that idea of breaking boundaries visually as a metaphor, in addition to the sort of the meaning of it. I think I talked about at the beginning, up at ubiquity and deconstruction, you sort of get this missed opportunity to quote Virgil using his quotes by using the true quotes. So you're doing the right thing, which is in this case the wrong thing. And so I was sort of sad that happened, but I understand why it happened. The pyramid of place names down at the bottom just seems like it's redundant because of the repetition within it, and it's also not necessary. It doesn't make any specific point. It doesn't really help the composition that much. So I'd really like to see those just sort of reduced to bug tracks or to exist somewhere else, maybe in one of those labels on the right-hand side of the composition. Finally, there are the three main ideas of this poster, or all these posters, which are ubiquity, deconstruction, and breaking boundaries. And we've seen various ways of dealing with those as a sort of troika, as a sort of triumvirate of themes. One is to subvert two of them so that only one of them has to be paid attention to, which is sort of what you've done here. But that leaves the other two in this sort of weird, this weird embrace with one another. So I wonder if at some point in any or all of these, whether those things get into conversation with one another, or we find a way to rationally push them aside. Maybe it again is one of those things where you take them and put them in a label on the right-hand side. That said, if they're going to all three be there, they should be in some kind of conversation with one another. The last thing, there's an artificiality to the layering that I mentioned at the top that I would really love to see resolve. Like if this escaped computer land and got into the physical world, when you started actually playing with true layering and transparency and then photographing it, I think you'd get a much more sort of material, sort of tactile feel to this that ultimately would draw people in a really sort of magnetic way. By and large, I like what I'm seeing here.
One thing I like about this is kind of the difference between the splashy centerpiece here and then the little organized squares on the side, which feel like stickers or packaging or a label on the side of a piece of artwork. So I kind of like the contrast between those two styles. But I agree with Charles that I think like there's too many changes with that kind of headline in the middle with changing weight and getting cut and kind of spilling over. It's a little bit too much, but I do like the variety of scale and kind of treatments you're using across.
I think the challenge with taking on a project like this, when you look at the Virgil's body of work, you can see that there is a playfulness, but also a restraint to what is and isn't done. And I think it's that tension that lives between these two things that makes those designs so iconic. And then we as designers and typographers, we try to do that and we don't fully quite understand. And so oftentimes we'll add so many different elements and it just seems like they're all fighting against each other. What I think is most successful in this composition is just the bold red box, the arrow, and then maybe some of the off-white symbol, that the four-pointed cross, and then just let everything else be subservient to this and just play around with this. There's some wonderful opportunities here for you to really, again, play with materials, printing out things on labels, adding them back on. You could easily take black gaffing tape and make that arrow out of black gaff tape. So there's a texture and a tactile kind of quality when you just look at it, because those are themes that Virgil explored. When Charles mentioned the blurred type, I'm like, where's the blurred type? If you're going to blur something, really blur it, because that's just like a little baby blur there. Push it a little bit so that we can see it. Even if it's artificial, at least the law of contrast still applies here. I think the ubiquity at the top, it looks like a little piece of tape, and I would have loved to explore that so that it's used for something other than just being at the top. One thing that you'll also find that in design, when you put an element on a page or a poster, you have to make it feel like it's part of a larger design concept. And so if you have something at the top, oftentimes if you're able to repeat that dimension somewhere else on the page, align it to maybe the middle third of the page itself, then we start to feel like, oh, these are not just people having separate parties, but this is one really big party. And because you can set type in so many different ways, you have to ask yourself, when I step away from how the tool allows me to work and I try to do these things like the cascading type, why am I doing that? And is it one too many tricks? And that's the problem. It's like whenever you watch cooking shows, it's usually get really great ingredients, do it the way people expect, and then make one twist, one unexpected break from it. And that's usually wonderful. Oftentimes what on these cooking shows, what they do is they're like, well, if a little bit of truffle is good, let's add a lot of truffle. And then it just becomes overpowering. It's just too much of a good thing. Okay. Maggie, I think you've done these critiques with us before, right? I think I recognize your name, or maybe I'm imagining.
No, but I'm in the pro group.
Oh, you're in the pro group. That's how I know your name. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Maggie. Do you have any questions for us or any comments?
All of your comments are really spot on. I was really struggling when I do this piece and my mind is going like monkey bananas. So I got totally overwhelmed. And let me tell you why I got overwhelmed. Because I got hung up most of the time. I was analyzing the information hierarchy. I thought there was so much information that I cannot tell a coherent story with it. I researched Virgil Abloh's life and story because I wasn't very familiar familiar with him. I want to understand the text between all of these, the relationship between all of these texts. So I know which two belong to the same hierarchy, which one should be the higher one. And then I should decide like, what is the central message or story I want to tell. Initially, I thought that's going to be Virgil Abloh's life. But then there's a variety of things, and Off-White and LVMH, just as like two of the biggest brands that he worked with. And then there's ubiquity and deconstruction. Where do I put that? Are those taglines? So I had probably in my mind, like putting all of these on the page and still make them fall into the right hierarchy and tell a coherent story. That's when I got so many ideas. Maybe this one should be dominant. Maybe this one is subordinate to this one. So eventually I just messed up myself and I wasn't satisfied with the piece, but I was so in need of help. So I'm very appreciative of all the feedback that you give me.
Well, I do like that about critiques, is that they're not it's not the end of the process. A critique is the beginning of the next part of the process. The conversation and what you just told us sort of lead me to believe that if I was able to check in with you in 2 weeks, this would be a really dramatically improved poster.
Yeah, I would also like to hear from either of you, if at the end we have time, how you analyze the text and what you would put as the information hierarchy. Not the design element, but just to help us analyze and understand it.
Well, let's do it right now. Charles, how do you, when you're looking at a block of copy, how do you begin? What's your process like? How do you prioritize one thing over something else?
A trick that I would play on myself, but that I in turn played on my students, which was to say, if you don't understand what the information is trying to tell you, then remove all formatting from it. So set it 10.5 on 16 point, flush left, rag right on a 20 pica measure, and read it in the order that it's set in. Just Helvetica, Helvetica regular, like as vanilla as you could possibly make it. And then read it and read it again until it tells you whether it's out of order or whether it's whether it's in the proper order. And if it's in the proper order, then can you start to insert line spaces in between the groups of information in order to understand how the grouping should work? And again, all of this you could do with a typewriter, but nobody uses typewriters anymore. So I've sort of resorted to 10.5 on 16 point, flush left, rag right, Helvetica on a 20 pica measure, just because that's all you ever really need to sort of understand what the information wants to tell you. Once you're there, if it doesn't ask for anything else, then you don't do anything else. You've deconstructed it. You've reduced it to its basic form. And if it doesn't ask for anything more, then it's not going to get it. Chances are something in that reading will tell you that it needs something more. That's our job. So how do the line breaks work? How does spacing work? What's the punctuation like? All of those are crucial pieces of information before you begin the design process.
I just wanted to say one quick editorial note here.
Go for it.
Mark and Jonah, I think that video with the audio of Charles saying that's a TikTok video, 10.5 point time, 16 something pica measure. Just repeat that over and over again. Let's make that go viral, guys. Okay, back over to you, Terrance.
I was just going to add, Charles used to be a book designer, so he is an expert at, slicing up information into a table of contents. So if you think about the information that way, if you had to present it in a magazine form or a book form, what's the title of the chapter? What's the subhead? So
yeah, and I mean it kind of goes back to the idea. I mean, the ideas that informed Virgil's work, which is semantics, construction, deconstruction, context. All of these things are really important to us as graphic designers, and they're crucial. They were crucial to me in my beginnings as a designer. And again, back to George Sadek, my Czechoslovakian mentor, he would say, "Jesus Christ, kid, just read the fucking text." He was like, all the answers for what it wants to be are in there. You just have to read it and listen. That's guided me for all of my career.
There was a lot of reference to Jesus Christ from your former boss.
He was, sorry. It's very, he was not very reverential. And he cursed like a truck driver. But that his turns of phrase, including his profanity, are very much locked in with my memory of him. So I apologize. I'm channeling him. I'm not speaking as myself. I don't usually take the Lord's name in.
So Maggie, one of the things that you could probably do when you're reading a block of text is first of all, do nothing to it. But when something speaks to you, celebrate that part and just choose one thing. It could just be the word ubiquity and riffing on that theme. Like, what does ubiquity mean? Or breaking boundaries. or just the date, like maybe making the date really important, saying he lived a very short and very productive and creative life, and it's short, but it's very sweet and powerful. You just pick one thing to celebrate and then let that be the theme. Like it's like when you're directing a movie or something, you have to find the spine of the story, and then everything else has to serve that. Otherwise, it's a distraction. Let's move on to the next person. Now, notice something. You see, we talked about this before. Traditionally speaking, the emblems of the shoe live flat on the shoe itself, and you can see here because they're not fastened down and they take their own shape and they cast a shadow. So easily, if you all just try to print things out on vinyl or different construction paper and didn't make everything so perfect, it creates its own life, and there's just something very magnetic that draws your eye in.
Yeah, he's kind of bringing the process of a collage to something that to a material that isn't collaged. Yeah, like a shoe.
Oh, good observation there. Nice.
The thing that I like about this the most, it's the plastic bag. It's the materiality of that plastic bag and the potential of it for containing the entire poster and sort of elevating, as Virgil did in some of his pieces, this idea of things in plastic bags as sought after objects. And it's really something that I think we know on this end of the consumer spectrum, that people on the luxury end of the consumer spectrum were just grasping as a result of his work, which is that there is this thin film of plastic actually creates value. When you put something in that, despite the fact that it's plastic, it creates this sort of sense of specialness about something, that it needs to be protected. And I would love to see that play a little bit more in this composition. Now, that said, there is way, way, way too much going on in this composition. One of the things that plastic bag and this centrality and very frank ubiquity with the proper improper quotes, the size and distribution of the place names, I find that all just great of a piece, like sort of, spread around, random, but at the same time, really pleasing. Now, I'm going to do something to this composition, which I felt in looking at it, made it 1,000 times better, which is just to remove now I've removed the plastic bag, which I was just telling you how much I loved. Now I'm deeply in love with this composition. Though it flows there are some things that need to be fixed, like why have these things play off each other in this sort of very boring diagonal relationship? They could just as easily drift into other parts of the margin. Look at the way that the hierarchy is established without that background, and look at the way that that those place names, which seemed so anchored artificially on the edges of those tears, and I'll bring it back so you can see it, now exist like leaves falling from a tree, or like a leaf in a brook that's flowing. There's a poetry and a sort of beautiful randomness and a sort of natural quality to the way that they sit on the page. It seems very anchored at the bottom left with Virgil, and that's the way it should be. That's the place in the composition that your eye comes to rest, and that's where he is. I don't have much more to say about this than that. Taking away is probably the thing that I would do most of these pieces. I would say that the Bowles imagery in the background is competing with everything else, and it's not adding to the composition. So I just like to see, it would be my first take this away. Yeah, editing, easiest way to find strength in a composition that you feel like you finished. Like, what happens if you kill your darlings? What happens if you get rid of the things that you hold dear, that you felt were the anchors in the composition? What are you left with? And is it better than the thing that you thought you loved? It's forcing us as viewers, as creators rather, to look at the composition like a viewer would look at it. That is to say, to look at it as a finished thing, and then you yourself decide how you can make it better. And usually that, to me, involves taking stuff away. I like this now without the background.
Yeah. And I think in my experience, that the tip with editing is it just takes time. You can't edit your thing as soon as you're finished doing it. You have to wait till tomorrow to do the editing, and in order for it to just sit for a minute. So I think that would be, yeah. Yeah,
sometimes you have to let up on the gas. Like, I find that my breakthroughs come at 4 a.m. when I'm in REM sleep mode, or in the shower when I'm, just concentrating on the feeling of how good warm water is running through my hair. Like, those are the moments when you're able to, you can't be at the work. You can't be consciously sort of like trying to hammer away at a problem. that then suddenly the sky is open, or the scales are lifted, or whatever other metaphor.
I think when you turned off all those layers, I'm missing the plastic part, which I thought was so special.
Yeah.
And also the hit of red and some of the halftone low res images that were in there. But when you took it away, I was able to kind of breathe. I kind of, my eye knew where to look, and now I could appreciate the texture and the typeset that you're playing around with here. One thing that I would generally advise people to avoid is to take type and just jam them into the corners. It feels not as intentional as it could, and you're not utilizing the space. If you look at the 1980, the 2021, and Virgil himself, they're all just pushed to the corner, and then it's like very centered in terms of its layout with the word ubiquity there. And I think there's some wonderful things that you can do, as Charles is playing around with this, to kind of show you what else can be done here in terms of how you play around with the type. And let's see where this leads to. But there's some really beautiful elements in here. The texture that exists behind the word Virgil Abloh and Tokyo is really cool to me. There's something that feels very organic about that. Where are you taking us on this, Charles?
I'm just getting them out of the corners. I mean,
okay,
it's more like, take that coffee table and move it to the center of the room.
Yeah, there's a lot that you can do there. So what I would suggest that you do is, how do you bring in a little bit of the color and the plastic without it being just so overwhelming for us to look at?
Yeah, I would love to bring that plastic bag back into it somehow. There was one other thing, and you're in a car. I'm jealous.
I can't, to be all right, honestly, right now, I don't know how I can't see myself or anything, but let me tell you something right now. How you said at 4 a.m, I definitely was at 4 a.m. trying to figure this out. Did my research like Megan did. It was like literally going through podcasts, literally like trying to understand like what I was creating so that it made sense, not only to me, but as like a designer, the people who are going to view this. And fun fact, because I was understanding that this was to be considered globally, I placed all the countries, so the United States, Paris, as if they would be on the map in that aspect. So kind of like loops you around.
Oh, neat. Thanks. So it's like how it would be laid out on a map, right? Like,
yeah,
geographically, like in its location relative to each other.
Yeah, correct. And,
so what was kind of like random and playful is actually, there's a layer of a thought and intentionality behind that.
I will admit this, Chris, I was reading the project framers, and something that stood out to me when you were, I think it was the video, the critique video that you had that you had done with someone previously about this experimental typography. Mm-hmm. One thing that you said to me that stuck was like, if you want to be comfortable, that's fine. Stay in your lane. Like all of us will just kind of like keep moving forward. I was like, oh man, like I've never done this before, but I was like, okay, let's go crazy. Let's do it.
Yes. When you're driving, stay in your lane. Otherwise, get out of your lane. So we'll link it all together. Okay. Wonderful. All right. I think it's time to move on to our last person from Charles' group, which is Kevin.
So Kevin's piece, I like a lot about it. It's very sort of frank again with Virgil's name, just saying it big and loud. I like the formal contrast, as Terrance pointed out in the earlier piece, between the word ubiquity and everything else on the page. I think that's fantastic. I even respond to the oversized shoelaces as a three-dimensional object. But then there's so much going on besides those three big things that I like. The shape of the sneaker being outlined by the type.
I have a question while we're going through this. I noticed that now a lot of the software on my Macintosh allows us to use smart quotes by default, but how do you go in and use prime marks or double prime marks?
That's a great question, because it does come up. First, you could turn off within the preferences. You can go in and turn off smart quotes, which seems counterintuitive. And again, it's global, so it's probably not what you want to do. But you can go into the type palette or to type menu and choose glyphs, and then you'll be able to find the actual prime marks instead of the quote marks, and you can insert them manually by double clicking on them in the glyphs palette.
I see.
Yeah, Adobe calls them typographers quotes.
So at the risk of killing all of the things that you love about this composition, Kevin, or all the things that you baked into it, it's the one too many notes, Herr Mozart kind of thing. Like maybe taking away 3 or 4 of the things that are happening within the composition and concentrating on the things that are that are most successful, like the sheer scale of this type. The beauty of this sort of formal contrast, this I find a little bit, that could be shrunk down to something smaller. Oops, I'm destroying the composition through this. But basically, getting away from these sort of larger lockups, and I'll undo all this stuff so you can see. I want a lot less in this. And so I keep taking pieces away from it and trying to figure out which of the things that you're doing here I like the most. Is it the stripes? Is it the large shoelaces? Is it, it's definitely not the shape of the shoe outlined by the letters. That I can tell you categorically is my least favorite part of the composition. But there's so much else going on in here that there's no need to sort of pick and choose. So yeah, I really want, and I'll point out this, you already had too many words to deal with. So this is the opposite of, if we go back to the piece with the stripes and the black frame, this is the opposite of that. You're adding more things into the composition that you don't need. You concentrate on grappling with the things that are already there and make them work perfectly. And then if at the end it says, I need something else, give it something else, but don't otherwise, leave that off the table. The one thing that I wanted to point out in this as a sort of, as a key takeaway, these pieces that are mock-ups and details, like this one in particular, this is a better composition than the composition. This is more Virgil Abloh than the poster itself is. What I'm saying is that the frame, the space surrounding it, and the context in which this appears, which you've created in this particular composition, is more powerful than the composition that you created. You've added the walls. You've taken your poster, as Virgil would have taken something else, and put it in a new context and given it power. So it's almost forgiving 1,000 sins by giving it the proper context. Does that carry? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, first of all, thank you so much for picking the graphic to be critiqued. Yeah, definitely. I did have some issues trying to come up with something that was, kind of minimal and clean, but at the same time, something that had a lot of information and something that, people would kind of stare for some time to kind of break down, the reasoning behind all of the different elements. And so, there was this Jordan Air sneaker that I really liked. And the thing is, I was kind of questioning to myself, how can I break down the elements of the sneaker into a poster? Because I understand that part of the brief was that it was going to be showcased right next to the piece. So I was I want to make sure the poster has the elements of the sneaker, but at the same time, it doesn't have a little photo, a photograph of the sneaker, but instead just going to have the main elements. So for example, here, what I kind of wanted to use was the color of the laces, which was part of the composition, or the shape, the outline of the sneaker. And even I was kind of thinking, why do I want to use red, just besides the fact that the sneaker is red? But I also thought that, the name of the countries their flags have red as a common color. So I was I want to use that part of, the common element in the flags of these different countries and kind of represented the overall composition. But yeah, what you're saying, it makes total sense to me.
Kevin, I want to climb inside of your head and just lean closer to the microphone rather than trying to pry open your ear and walk in. It is any of those things. Any one of them is right. Any one of them is some lever for creativity, but all of them together are not serving you. And they're not serving your viewers. They're not serving anyone. Let all the voices shout, but then listen to the loudest one and really serve it. Don't water it down by introducing another concept on top of it, because they will fight with one another and nobody wins. So when I looked at the Paris, China, Tokyo, Japan, United States, that little lockup, I thought, oh, that's cool. If that was the only thing in the composition, if that was a composition unto itself, and that's what the poster was about, that would be awesome. But layered on top of the shape of the outline of the shoe and everything else that's going on in the composition, I just wanted to scream at the poster, not at you. Give me one thing. Give me one moment where I can sort of bask in the meaning of this poster. But I kept being pulled in different directions. Your darling, in this case, the thing that you love most, the shape of that shoe, is the thing that you need to kill in this composition. It's what you got to get rid of. It's and I'm saying that as I'm your new type friend. I'm saying that as a concerned citizen or whatever you want me to be, but somebody who genuinely, sympathetically cares for your progress. It's what you got to do. You just got to let go of it. But something in what you said really resonated, which is that the shape of the shoe and the composition of the shoe, the form of the shoe, all of that really, was something that motivated you, that appeals to you. And I would love to see that not into creating the shoe over again out of type, but to look at the shoe itself. Like Terrance said, we've all got phones and access to practically every photograph that was ever photographed in the history of the world. So, give me the shoe, show me the shoe, find a new way of using it, deconstruct it, flatten it, make it into a plan, do something with it. But, be Virgil with it, be bold, give it a new context.
Charles, when you were turning off layers, I thought the design got better with each layer that you turned off, which is an exercise you all can do. When you get that tunnel vision, or as Maggie had, like monkey brain, tell monkey brain to be quiet for a little bit as the adult in the room, just turn off layers. And first, when you picked this design, Charles, I'm like, oh my God, what is he going to do with this one? And just simply allowing the shoelaces, which I really like once you turn off all this extra stuff, how it wraps around the top and it continues through. It makes it feel much more dimensional. I think it's a really good thing that you're doing. Having really big, bold type like the Virgil Abloh, the way you've typeset it, that also looks really good. Just because you can put type on a path doesn't mean that you should. And generally speaking, you probably should never. Just generally speaking, right? You can work around all these things. And keep in mind this thing, that if this is part of a traveling exhibition, we're going to have the shoe to look at in front of us. So showing me the shoe again in the exact same way, or the silhouette, doesn't do a lot. We have to do something else. So think about it. We complement what is there. We don't mirror it. You're not trying to do the shoe, the poster version of the same shoe. You just draw apart some things that you like and you highlight that, and it allows us to really appreciate the shoe even more. And that's the part I'm coming from. So one of the things that you can do as you are all battling this, when you have so many elements, reduce the variables, use one typeface, use fewer point sizes, use one weight. And here we've got like a lot of different things going on. We got a capsule looking shape that surrounds the address, and we're using a bold typeface with maybe a thinner light. It's just so many different things. And if you were just take some of these things and scale them down 70-80%, it gives the rest of the posters room to breathe and for your eye to navigate around, so it doesn't feel like you're just jamming everything into one part. But look how much more powerful this poster is now. This looks like a really cool hang tag or a gigantic banner. You can do a lot with this. It's just because it's much simpler to work with, okay? So whenever you're confused, turn off layers, simplify the design choices that you're making, and just leave it kind of grouped together as a block of information, and then explore within that. I think an opportunity here could have been to maybe have this typeset like embroidered. So Virgil Abloh you can see the stitching, and that would be amazing, and do something with that. So that's your one element of dimensionality besides the shoelace. I think that would have been really dope for you to do. I'll pause here, Terrance.
Yeah, similar. I think you guys covered it all, and kind of creating more negative space for this one, helps. And again, with the shoe is like the shoelace already says shoe, and then the outline of the shoe says shoe again. So it's it's repeating. And I like kind of the subtleness of the shoelace without the image of the shoe is much more sophisticated way of communicating that. So I think those are all good. And it reminds me of my design education when I had a teacher ask me to do 100 thumbnail sketches of what a business card was going to be before touching a computer. And I think that's what we've seen a couple of posters today that are kind of overlapping too many ideas into one thing. And I think if you were to force yourself to draw 100 thumbnails on paper, it would get easier to separate those ideas as to have kind of one per thumbnail in that way. So that could be another exercise you could try at home too.
Yeah, and as a fellow teacher at Parsons used to say, I always have to remind the students that the thumbnails are roadmaps. They are maps to what the final piece will look like. It's just a matter of choosing through them. But a lot of them will do 100 sketches and then put the sketches away and go and do the composition and not pay attention to the thing that they actually made that has the power. It will take you there.
I wanted to just highlight one thing and ask you two questions that are coming in from the chat here. Charles, you were talking about take the shoe, flatten out, deconstruct it, do something with it. You could, Kevin, you wouldn't probably want to do this with a pair of Off-Whites, but you can get a used pair of Jordans and take some materials and break it apart, take the sole apart, deconstruct the eyelets, the laces, and lay them flat, sandwich them down, and just do something with that. That would be wonderful. That way it's complementing the design versus just mirroring it. Now, here's the question. I think you already answered this question. This one comes from Stephanie Anderson. Where do you teach, Charles?
Right here, right now.
Yeah. You're in it right now.
Yeah, no, I taught for a long time. I taught for 2 decades at Parsons. And when I started working at Monotype, coincided with the birth of my son and later the birth of my daughter. And so the time that I have to actually dedicate to teaching has been decidedly curtailed. But I love opportunities like this and working with our clients to to offer what I can to sort of help the graphic conversation along.
And if you know, there's a parallel here. If you're a fan of Project Runway, I think Charles is like the Tim Gunn of design. Like he's dropping terms and people are like, what did he say again? We'll have to listen back to this and then use a dictionary and just follow along, everybody.
It's funny. Tim Gunn, he interviewed me for Parsons.
Oh, he did?
Yeah.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's assistant dean at that point. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a question coming in from David Coe. David Coe is asking this question. I'm drawn to Charles's mention of killing your darlings, the ideas or details that we get emotionally attached to. How do you tell when you're making darlings out of the ideas or elements? And how do you make yourself kill your darlings in order to move forward in that work? Great question, by the way, David.
Usually it's somebody saying, you've got to get rid of that. Because I tell you, your darlings are so close to you, it's often difficult to see them yourself as your pets. And again, all of this is morbid, but the idea is that these things grow so close to you that you can't imagine life without them until somebody says, you should really let go of that.
Somebody like Charles comes along, who's your new type BFF, tells you, get rid of it, then it's time.
It's like flipping a coin. Like heads or tails, and then you flip it and it comes up heads, and you're like, you just ask yourself how you feel about it once you got rid of it. Once you have to contemplate getting rid of it.
I love the coin flipping because if you're disappointed by what the coin shows you, either way the coin lands, it reveals what your true feelings are about it. But I think we're also bumping into this area of like art versus design, and if you are creating art and it's only for yourself, that's your darling. And if you are creating a piece of design that is intended to serve someone else, that's where holding on to the darling can be risky because it's too personal. So I think that's kind of a tension. And maybe even if you're a fine artist and you're working by yourself and you have all these darlings, and then you get to a gallery, right? And the curator at the gallery says, this piece is stronger than this one. I think we should keep that one in the back. So life is full of editing, I suppose. Yeah.